In the annals of naval warfare, the engagement that took place off the coast of Samar on the morning of October the 25th, 1944, stands not merely as a battle, but as a singular anomaly in the history of conflict at sea. It was a collision between the grandest ambitions of imperial power and the desperate, improvised courage of a screening force that, by all metrics of naval engineering and tactical doctrine, had no business surviving, let alone fighting. The battle off Samar, the centerpiece of the massive, sprawling engagement known as the Battle for Leyte Gulf, pitted the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force, a surface fleet of overwhelming lethality aimed at the soft underbelly of the American invasion of the Philippines, against a small, unassuming unit designated Task Unit 77.4.3, known to history by its voice call sign Taffy 3. Within this grossly mismatched confrontation, the actions of the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE 413, represent the absolute apex of asymmetric naval combat. A vessel displacing a mere 1,350 tons, designed for the slow, methodical work of anti-submarine warfare, found itself standing as the final fragile barrier between the battleships of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and the vulnerable transport ships of General Douglas MacArthur's Liberation Force. The Roberts, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, did not merely endure the engagement. She aggressively prosecuted it, charging into the teeth of 14-inch and 8-inch gunfire to deliver a torpedo attack in a sustained gunnery barrage that entered naval legend. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the events of that October morning, one must first dissect the capabilities and the critical, terrifying limitations of the platform involved. The Samuel B. Roberts was a John C. Butler-class destroyer escort, a ship type born of necessity during the desperate days of the Battle of the Atlantic, but adapted for the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Pacific theater. Unlike the fleet destroyers of the Fletcher or Gearing classes, which were designed as fast, multi-role surface combatants capable of fleet actions, the destroyer escort was an economy design, built quickly and cheaply to fill the gaps in the fleet. The Roberts was small, 306 feet long with a beam of just over 36 feet, displacing roughly 1,350 tons standard and 1,700 tons fully loaded. She was powered by two geared steam turbines fed by two boilers, driving two shafts to produce 12,000 shaft horsepower. While respectable for convoy duty, her design speed was only 24 knots, sufficient to catch a submerged submarine or escort a merchant convoy, but woefully, fatally inadequate for a surface engagement against heavy cruisers capable of 30 to 35 knots. In naval combat, speed is life. It dictates the ability to control the range of engagement or, when outmatched, to retreat. The Roberts possessed neither option against the Japanese center force. Furthermore, the ship was effectively unarmored. Her hull was constructed of 3/8-inch mild steel, essentially the same thickness as a standard commercial building frame, strong enough to withstand the sea but permeable to even the smallest caliber enemy fire. She was, in the vernacular of the crew, a tin can in the truest, most vulnerable sense. The disparity in firepower was equally stark. The Roberts mounted two 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, one forward at Mount 51 and one aft at Mount 52. While these were excellent weapons capable of a high rate of fire, roughly 15 to 22 rounds per minute, the Roberts lacked the advanced Mark 37 fire control system found on fleet destroyers, relying instead on a simpler, less effective director system that required more manual input and estimation. For torpedoes, she carried a single triple-tube mount for 21-inch Mark 15 torpedoes. A fleet destroyer carried 10. The Roberts carried only 3. This meant the ship had only one opportunity, one single moment to launch a torpedo attack. Once those 3 fish were in the water, she was effectively a gunboat with no heavy knockout punch. Her primary teeth were the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar and depth charges, weapons entirely useless against surface ships unless used in a desperate theoretical attempt to mine the water in the path of a pursuing enemy. However, the hardware of the Samuel B. Roberts was secondary to her software, the crew. The ship was manned by approximately 220 officers and men, the vast majority of whom were drawn from the United States Naval Reserve. These were not career sailors steeped in the traditions of the sea. They were civilians in uniform, farmers, students, clerks, who had been mobilized for the duration of the conflict. At the helm was Lieutenant Commander Robert Witcher Copeland, a 34-year-old lawyer from Tacoma, Washington. Copeland was an improbable hero in the context of naval tradition. He was not a product of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, but a reservist who had spent the interwar years practicing law. His previous commands included a tugboat and a patrol yacht, yet he possessed a leadership style that prioritized transparency and mutual respect, traits that forged a cohesive unit out of a disparate crew. He understood the limitations of his ship intimately, noting in his reports that he felt a profound responsibility to his men, knowing that their ship was too small to fight and too slow to run. This realism did not breed defeatism, rather it bred a grim professional resolve, as Copeland treated his crew as stakeholders in their own survival. The spirit of the ship was enshrined in its very name. Coxswain Samuel Booker Roberts Jr. had been a reservist who died at Guadalcanal in September 1942. During the evacuation of a Marine unit, Roberts had voluntarily steered his Higgins boat directly toward enemy fire to draw attention away from other evacuation craft, silencing a Japanese machine gun with his own weapon before being mortally wounded. This narrative of self-sacrifice, of the small drawing fire to protect the vulnerable, was the foundational mythos of DE 413. Commissioned in April 1944, the Samuel B. Roberts underwent a hurried shakedown period, and by October 1944 she had escorted convoys to Eniwetok and screened the invasion force at Leyte. Her operational tempo was high, but her combat experience was limited to anti-submarine patrols and anti-aircraft drills. The crew had never engaged a surface target. Jack Hewson, a young seaman on board who had lied about his age to join the Navy at 17, recalled the atmosphere as one of nervous anticipation on a ship that felt frighteningly small in the vast Pacific swells. To understand why the Samuel B. Roberts was placed in such a precarious position, one must analyze the broader strategic failure that left Taffy 3 exposed. The American naval presence at Leyte Gulf was divided into two major commands: the U.S. 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, responsible for close support of the landings, and the U.S. 3rd Fleet under Admiral William Bull Halsey, responsible for covering the operation against the Japanese main fleet. Japanese naval planners, realizing they could not win a symmetrical battle, devised Plan Shogo 1, a complex deception involving a northern force of empty aircraft carriers sent to lure Halsey's powerful battleships away. Meanwhile, the center force under Admiral Kurita, comprising the bulk of Japan's remaining surface strength, including the battleships Yamato and Musashi, would slip through the San Bernardino Strait and descend on the undefended transports at Leyte. The deception worked perfectly. On the night of October 24th, Halsey, believing Kurita's center force had been turned back by airstrikes that sank the Musashi, took his entire fleet north to chase the decoys, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Consequently, when the sun rose on October 25th, the only force standing between Kurita's 23 warships and the thousands of American troops on the beach was Task Group 77.4, the Taffys. Taffy 3, the northernmost unit commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, was the first to be detected. The morning began with routine anti-submarine patrols, but at 6:45, lookouts on the Roberts and other screen vessels spotted anti-aircraft bursts on the northern horizon. Initially, there was confusion, with radio chatter speculating these were friendly forces, but at 6:58, the visual evidence became undeniable as the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese capital ships broke the horizon. The center force had arrived, and Admiral Kurita, spotting the small carriers and mistaking them for the large fleet carriers of Halsey's 3rd Fleet, ordered a general attack, abandoning rigid formation to close with the enemy. The first indication of the enemy's caliber came in the form of massive geysers of water erupting around the Taffy 3 carriers as the Yamato opened fire from 17 miles away. Survivors from the Roberts recalled a surreal, almost cinematic detail. The water splashes were colored. The Japanese used dye markers in their armor-piercing shells to help spotters distinguish between ships in the chaos of battle. The Yamato used non-dyed white splashes, the Nagato pink, the Congo yellow, and the Haruna green. This technicolor bombardment signaled to Lieutenant Commander Copeland that they were not facing cruisers or destroyers. They were facing battleships. The 18.1-inch shells of the Yamato weighed as much as a standard American automobile. A single hit would not just damage the destroyer escort, it would vaporize it. With the carriers turning east to launch aircraft and make smoke, The screen was ordered to interpose themselves between the hunters and the prey. It was at this moment, around 7:15, that Copeland made the decision to address his crew via the 1MC circuit. His words, verified by multiple survivors, stripped away the veneer of hope to focus on duty. He did not promise victory, nor did he promise safety. He said, "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." This psychological framing was critical. By declaring survival impossible, Copeland liberated his men from the paralyzing fear of death, shifting the objective from staying alive to selling the ship dearly. At 7:35, Admiral Sprague ordered the destroyers, the Howell, Heermann, and Johnston, to launch a torpedo attack, and Sprague then ordered the Little Fellows, the destroyer escorts, to follow. Copeland ordered flank speed. Down in the engine room, the engineers bypassed safety valves, pushing the boilers to their absolute limit until the Roberts, vibrating violently, reached nearly 29 knots, 5 knots faster than her theoretical maximum. She steered toward the heavy cruiser line, an approach that required the ship to close from 14,000 yards to 4,000 yards, point-blank range in naval terms, under heavy fire. To survive this approach, Copeland utilized the smokescreens laid by the destroyers and employed a tactic known as chasing salvos. He steered toward the splashes of enemy shells, gambling on the tendency of gunners to correct their aim. If a shell landed 100 yards off the port bow, the next would likely be corrected to the right, so Copeland would steer left, directly into the site of the previous miss. This intuitive understanding of ballistics and human psychology allowed the Roberts to close the distance unscathed for nearly 20 minutes, a feat of seamanship that bordered on the miraculous. Emerging from the smoke at 7:40 at a range of just 4,000 yards, the Roberts found herself dangerously close to the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai. The proximity was such that the cruiser's 8-inch guns could not depress low enough to track the small escort, and their shells screamed harmlessly overhead. Copeland ordered the torpedoes fired, and the 3 Mark 15 hissed into the water. The Roberts immediately executed a hard turn to retreat behind the smoke as the crew watched the wake of the torpedoes. Moments later, lookouts reported a massive explosion on the Chokai's stern. For decades, it was believed the Roberts blew the stern off the Chokai, though 2022 forensic evidence suggests the Roberts may have missed, or the damage was different. Nevertheless, at the time, the crew believed they had crippled a heavy cruiser, boosting morale significantly. Having expended her torpedoes, standard doctrine would suggest the Roberts retreat to the disengaged side of the carriers to act as a smoke layer. Copeland, however, chose to stay in the fight. He reasoned that his 5-inch guns, though unable to penetrate hull armor, could devastate the delicate superstructures of the Japanese ships. For the next hour, the Samuel B. Roberts engaged in a duel that defied physics, selecting the heavy cruiser Chikuma as her primary target and closing to within 5,300 yards, suicidally close. The crew of Mount 51 and Mount 52 fired with a rhythm that bordered on mechanical failure, expending over 600 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. Crucially, they utilized proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, VT fuses, which detonated in airbursts over the Japanese decks. These shells, designed to down planes, turned the decks of the Japanese cruisers into slaughterhouses, killing exposed crews, shredding radar antennas, and blinding the enemy's fire control optics. The intensity of fire from the Roberts and her sister ships confused Kurita, who became convinced he was engaging a force of cruisers and fleet destroyers. This led him to keep using armor-piercing AP ammunition. These shells, designed to fuse only after passing through thick armor, punched clean through the Roberts' thin hull without detonating, a phenomenon known as overpenetration. Shell after shell passed through the unarmored ship, leaving neat holes but failing to explode. This irony, that the ship was too weak to trigger the enemy's fuses, saved the Roberts from immediate destruction multiple times. But the Roberts' luck could not hold indefinitely. As she closed on the Chikuma around 8:50, the Japanese fleet began to bracket her effectively. At 8:51, a salvo of 3 8-inch shells struck the Roberts, likely high-explosive shells or AP shells that finally met enough resistance to detonate. These hits caused severe damage, but the ship fought on. Then at 9 o'clock, the killing blow arrived. A 14-inch shell, almost certainly from the battleship Congo, struck the Roberts in the number 2 engine room. The impact was cataclysmic. It tore a hole 40 feet long and 10 feet wide in the port side. The after-engine room was obliterated, steam lines were severed, and all power was lost. The Samuel B. Roberts coasted to a halt, dead in the water. With her engines silent and her rudder jammed, she became a stationary target for the Japanese gunners. As the order to abandon ship was contemplated, a tragedy of heroic proportions played out in the aft 5-inch gun mount, Mount 52. The gun captain was gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, a 20-year-old from Chakota, Oklahoma. Throughout the battle, Mount 52 had maintained a furious rate of fire, causing the barrel to grow so hot that the paint blistered and burned off. Crucially, when the engine room was hit, the ship lost the compressed air pressure required for the gas ejection system. This system was vital. It blew unburnt powder gas out of the breech after firing. Without it, opening the breech to load a new powder charge risked a cook-off, an immediate catastrophic explosion of the propellant due to the residual heat of the barrel. Carr and his crew knew this. They understood that every time they opened the breech, they were risking their lives. Yet seeing the Japanese ships closing in to finish them off, they continued to load and fire manually. They fired 6 rounds this way. On the 7th, the inevitable happened. The powder cooked off before the breech was closed. The explosion wrecked the mount, killing most of the crew instantly. When a survivor, Lieutenant Bill Burton, entered the mount moments later, he found Paul Carr. Carr was torn open from his neck to his groin, his intestines exposed, yet he was still conscious. He was holding the last 54-pound projectile in the mount, struggling to lift it into the breech of the destroyed gun. He begged Burton to help him load the round. Carr died minutes later, his final act an attempt to fire one last shot at the enemy. At 9:10, Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. The stern was settling rapidly. The crew, many wounded, scrambled into the oil-slicked water. They had few life rafts, many had been shredded by shrapnel, leaving them to rely on floater nets and life vests. As the ship slipped beneath the waves at 10:05, sinking stern first, a Japanese destroyer approached the survivors. The men in the water braced for machine gun fire, a common atrocity in the Pacific War. Instead, in a moment that starkly contrasted with the brutality of the battle, the Japanese captain appeared on the bridge and offered a salute to the men in the water, a recognition of the ferocity with which the tiny ship had fought. While the Roberts sank, the unthinkable happened. Admiral Kurita, commanding the most powerful surface fleet left in the Pacific, ordered a retreat. He had been convinced by the aggression of Taffy III that he was facing the main strength of the U.S. Third Fleet. Fearing air attacks and claiming to be low on fuel, he turned the center force back toward the San Bernardino Strait. The sacrifice of the Roberts, Johnston, and Howell had saved the invasion force. For the 120 survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts, the battle was over, but the fight for survival had just begun. They would spend the next 50 hours floating in the Philippine Sea. The water was warm, but the exposure was relentless. During the day, the tropical sun burned their skin, which was coated in heavy fuel oil from the ship's bunkers. The oil caused chemical burns and blinded men, though it arguably protected them from even worse sunburn and initially hid them from predators. However, the oil could not hide them forever. The waters off Samar were infested with sharks. Survivor accounts, such as those of Jack Hewson, describe a nightmare scenario. By the first night, sharks began to attack. The men formed circles, putting the wounded in the center, kicking and splashing to drive the predators away. To watch all those guys get killed by those goddamn sharks, it was terrible, Hewson recalled. The attacks were sporadic but terrifyingly silent. A man would simply be pulled under or scream once before disappearing. Thirst became the primary enemy. As dehydration set in, men began to hallucinate. Some believed they saw islands or ships and swam away, never to be seen again. Others drank seawater, succumbing to salt poisoning, which induced madness and rapid death. Even in the water, Copeland tried to command. He moved between the rafts and nets, checking on men. However, by the second night, his physical strength failed. He recalled, "I gave out. I just folded up." His men, recognizing his state, held him up in a raft, physically supporting their captain just as he had supported them morally during the battle. On the morning of October the 27th, 3 days after the sinking, a landing craft infantry LCI flotilla, escorted by a patrol craft, spotted the oil slick and the debris. 120 men were pulled from the water. 89 of their shipmates had been lost. For 78 years, the Samuel B. Roberts existed only in memory and archives. On June 22, 2022, that changed. Explorer Victor Vescovo, piloting the submersible limiting factor, located the wreck of DE-413. The depth was staggering, 6,895 meters, or 22,621 feet. This depth makes the Samuel B. Roberts the deepest shipwreck ever identified and surveyed by a manned submersible, exceeding the depth of the USS Johnston found the previous year. The forensic imagery confirmed the violence of the ship's end. The bow section showed impact damage but was relatively intact, still bearing the scars of the battle. The stern, however, was separated or heavily damaged, consistent with the catastrophic 14-inch shell hit to the engine room described by survivors. The tripod mast had fallen, toppled by shell fire or the hydraulic shock of the sinking. Most poignantly, the empty torpedo tubes confirmed the launch against the Chokai. The discovery also led to a reevaluation of the Chokai hit. One of the most significant historical debates centers on the Roberts torpedo attack. The crew claimed they blew the stern off the heavy cruiser. However, the discovery of the Chokai wreck by the RV Petrel in 2019 complicated this narrative. The Chokai's wreck shows her torpedo tubes are intact, and her stern, while damaged, was not blown off in the manner described. Naval historians now believe the explosion seen by the Roberts crew may have been a secondary explosion on the Chokai caused by a bomb hit from a Taffy 3 aircraft that detonated her own oxygen torpedoes, or a near miss. Alternatively, the Roberts torpedoes may have malfunctioned or missed narrowly. Despite this forensic correction, the tactical effect remains valid. The attack forced the Japanese cruiser line to take evasive action, spoiling their fire solutions on the carriers at a critical moment. The fog of war led the crew to claim a kill that likely belonged to naval aviators, but their bravery in delivering the attack is undiminished. The story of the Samuel B. Roberts is not merely a tale of a ship sinking, it is a case study in the capacity of the human spirit to overcome material inferiority. From a strategic perspective, the loss of the Roberts was a tactical necessity that yielded a strategic victory. The delay inflicted by Taffy 3 allowed the indispensable beachhead at Leyte to remain secure. Had Kurita broken through, the transport fleet would have been annihilated, potentially setting the U.S. Pacific campaign back by months and costing thousands of lives. From a leadership perspective, Lieutenant Commander Copeland's conduct offers a timeless lesson. By managing expectations honestly, telling his men that survival cannot be expected, while demanding maximum effort, we will do what damage we can, he extracted performance from his reservist crew that exceeded the design limits of their machine. In his final action report, written while recovering from the ordeal, Copeland penned a passage that has become part of the Navy's soul. It was my great honor to command this ship and this crew, fighting against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. In the face of this knowledge, the men zealously manned their stations and fought with such calmness, courage, and efficiency that no higher honor could be conceived than to command such a group of men. The wreckage of DE-413 now lies nearly 7,000 meters deep, a permanent war grave protected by the crushing pressure of the abyss. But the legacy of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship endures, a testament to the day when the smallest ship in the fleet cast the longest shadow.